Hello everyone, and welcome to our AESC presentation on reviewing stratigraphic units defined in the ACT. This project has been undertaken under the context of the Australian Stratigraphy Commission, which is a standing committee of the Geological Society of Australia. I would like to begin by first acknowledging the traditional owners on whose lands we meet today and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be listening. Now, before we begin, just some useful definitions. So for non-stratigraphers, stratotypes serve as the defining benchmark for lithostratigraphic units, and they generally consist of type sections and type localities or type areas. And these are representative sections or areas of the unit with good exposure, display boundary relations with adjacent units, are accessible to all interested, and there must ideally be a reasonable assurance of their preservation. Now, the usual role for members of the Australian Stratigraphy Commission is to assist geologists with appropriate naming and definition of stratigraphic units, developing stratigraphic principles and classification for Australia, and contributing to any updates to the international guide. However, as members of the ACT Subcommission, our situation is slightly different from other states and territories, as there has been no new mapping or revision of geological units in the ACT since ABLE in 1991, which only really covers the northeastern ACT. The rest of the ACT's unit descriptions and definitions are even older, with many originally being done by OPIC in 1958, with some never having been revised. As you can imagine, in the intervening years, urban development and landscape modifications within the ACT may have altered or destroyed the original stratotype of these units. Therefore, it was decided by members of the ACT Subcommission to review the type section locations of units defined in the ACT, with the initial aims being to make it easier to find extant stratotypes, by revising location descriptions to a single modern coordinate system, GDA 2020 in our case, to consider replacement stratotypes where originals have been destroyed or are no longer accessible, to assign new reference sections where possible, and additionally, we hope this project may form a sort of guide and be of use to people who undertake similar work. Now, Canberra's geology largely evolved during and after a period of prolonged subduction on the northeastern margin of Gondwana in three broad tectonic cycles of crustal contraction, extension, and associated magmatism from the Ordovician to the Carboniferous. Now, these rocks are largely a mixture of sedimentary, volcanic, and associated plutonic rocks, and the older basement is somewhat a matter of conjecture, largely interpreted from chemical data of White et al. Now, we began our research by consulting the Australian Stratigraphic Units database, reviewing the 78 current units in the ACT, and thereafter narrowing down to the 22 units that are defined in the ACT. We then researched details of the type sections by using the important references identified in the ASUD, in this case, Bob Abel's BMR Bulletin 233, Owen and Wyborn's BMR Bulletin 204, and Doug Finlayson's Geological Guide to the Canberra area, and associated maps and figures with these publications. From there, we compared with Google Earth the various descriptions of stratotype locations, given in a variety of old coordinate systems and with references to features that may have been built up or destroyed since. We thus began our initial field trip, starting in the morning with a visit to the Federal Golf Course Tonalite, funnily enough, on the Federal Golf Course. After following Abel's original location advice, we discovered that the so-called boulder of the original type section no longer was present, but rather all we could find of the Tonalite was this subcrop in the side of a dam on the golf course, suggesting that the original boulder is no longer accessible or visible, and therefore there's some question as to whether this locality is still useful as a stratotype of the Tonalite in the future. Now, here you can see a bit of a closer example of the Tonalite, and on the right, some boulders that were originally flagged as potentially belonging to the Tonalite. However, we discovered they were much more mafic in character and therefore not likely of this unit. From there, we headed to the northeastern access road, where there is a very high quality exposure of a boulder of the Federal Golf Course Tonalite, with fresh surfaces clearly visible, and this has been cracked open for geochronology work. And to the top of this photograph on the left here, you can see a red hill on which the Yarralamla Formation sits and has been hornfelsed by the Tonalite. It was very good to see that the boulder was still present and in great condition, preserving its fresh exposure. And it is our opinion that eventually this could at the very least be a reference section of the unit. Proceeding from there, we attempted to find further outcrops of the Tonalite along the access road, but to no avail. From there, we headed to the State Circle Geoheritage site along the State Circle Road near Parliament House. Now, here you can clearly see the underlying State Circle shale and unconformably overlain by the Camp Hill sandstone member of the Canberra Formation. Now, our main aim in this area was not so much to make sure the outcrop was still there, given that it is a geoheritage site, but rather to take modern coordinates in GDA 2020 of this outcrop. And this outcrop preserves amazing geological features, and as a result has been used as an education tool here in the ACT. Now, following on from there, we paid a visit to the Mount Ainslie Volcanics on the side of Mount Ainslie. So climbing the flanks, we saw that the area was still suitable as a type area of the volcanics, and we took samples in a few locations, observing the bulk lithology, which in this case is a dacitic ignimbrite. Now, outcrop on the Mount Ainslie area varies from this sort of subcrop that you can see on the left-hand side to fresher exposures, but this area is still very much in good condition and therefore still a good type area. Now, our final visit was to a reference section of the Narrabundah Ashstone member. We visited the reference section because the original type section, located in a small quarry in Narrabundah near the Monaro Highway, is overgrown and no longer visible. So we wanted to visit the reference section here to see if this could in future be a useful upgraded section to a type section. But you can see that this outcrop is very heavily weathered, quite rubbly, and there is only a few spots where there is good quality fresh exposure. So work remains to be done in the future as to whether or not this will be a suitable replacement for the original type section. Now, this project is still in the initial stages. We need to follow up this first field trip with others in the Canberra and broader ACT region to investigate other units and their type sections. We also need to investigate engineering drill core for ACT units, particularly where ACT units have been defined on the basis of drill core. And we need to see who presently has it or whether or not the core is still accessible. We also need to continue discussions with land managers and data custodians, for example, talking to staff at the Federal Golf Course in relation to whether or not the boulder has been moved or is just overgrown somewhere in the original area that we were not able to spot. But work will continue in the new year, and we will aim to fully cover all the 22 units that are defined within the ACT region. Thank you all for listening to this talk, and please join us for our live Q&A session. We hope to see you there. Cheers.